Hello everyone, and welcome to our Chapter 5 screencast, where we're going to talk about the body as a whole. So first we have our basic cell structure. This is the functional unit of life. Inside here you can see that we have chromosomes, and these are thread-like structures that we're going to find in the nucleus of our cell. So that's this purple grape-like looking thing in the picture. And this is going to function in transmission of genetic information. Each of our chromosomes are going to consist of double strands of our DNA. So what DNA stands for is deoxyribonucleic acid. We also are going to have the fluid-like substance in here as our cytoplasm, and suspended in that cytoplasm we have our organelles. So you'll be discussing this more in a biology or A&P course. So here we have Golgi apparatus, for example, our rough ER, mitochondria. So a lot of these terms might be a little familiar to you from past courses as well. So now let's talk about the organization of our body. The smallest components would be our atoms or ions, and that builds up. The smallest component would be our atoms or ions, and that builds up to our molecules. And from there, our molecules are making up our organelles. Our organelles we just saw belong inside each of our cells. So these are individual cells here, our functional units of life, and cells come together to make up tissues. So our tissues are made of a bunch of cells, and those come together to create our organs. Now we just keep in mind have four major tissue types. We have connective tissue, epithelial tissue, nervous tissue, and muscular tissue. So most of our organs are composed of all four of those types of tissues. So our example here is a lung, and our lung belongs to a body system. So many organs will come together to create a body system. In this case, the system we're talking about is the respiratory system. So that would also consist with things like bronchi and alveoli and the trachea, your larynx, your nasal passages, and more than that. And these body systems would come together to create an organism. So next we're just going to talk about a couple of our body systems and what they're responsible for. Each of our body systems has a specific function, and we're going to talk about it in more detail in later chapters this quarter. So first we have our muscular system, and this makes movement possible. It pulls on our bones and works with our joints to help us move. Next we have our skeletal system. This is going to help provide protection. So for example, our skull protects our brain, as well as other sensory structures, or our thoracic cage protects our lungs and our heart. It's also going to help give us form. Without our skeleton, we would just be a pile of jelly on the floor with organs just kind of hanging out there, and gives us shape for our body, as well as our bones store minerals and also some of our blood cells. Next we have our cardiovascular system, and this is going to work to deliver oxygen, nutrients, and also our vital substances throughout our body. It can also transport cellular waste products to our lungs and kidneys. Next we have our lymphatic system. A lot of people don't understand what the lymphatic system does, but basically it's helping to maintain the internal fluid environment within our body, but we also have it producing some types of blood cells, and it helps to regulate our immunity. So it works with our immune system. Next we have respiratory system, and this is helping to bring oxygen into our body while it's removing our waste product, carbon dioxide, and also some water waste. Last on this slide, we have digestive system, and this is providing our body with water, nutrients, and minerals, and removing solid waste from our body. Moving on to our other body systems, we have our urinary system, and a lot of people think urinary system, it's going to create urine, but how does it do that? within the kidneys, it actually filters our blood. It cleanses our blood and removes waste products from there to create the urine. So it's removing waste products from cellular metabolism to help maintain our electrolytes and our fluid balance within our body. Next, we have reproductive system, and this, if you didn't know, is responsible for procreation. And then we have our integumentary system, and this is providing an external covering for protection so that pathogens cannot get into our body. It's also regulating our body temperature and our water content. This skin helps make up the largest organ within our body, so we really need to appreciate that. Then we have our nervous system, and that is coordinating the reception of certain stimuli that come into our body and transmitting the message of that stimuli. So if you're looking at your computer screen is giving you visual information that's being transmitted over to your brain. And it's also going to help us to stimulate movement. So nerves will go over to your muscles and cause contraction. And then lastly, we have endocrine, and this is going to secrete hormones to help regulate our body activities. Next, we're going to talk about some cell development terms. We have the suffix plasia, which means formation. So these are just some examples of words that use the suffix plasia. We have dysphagia, which would mean we have abnormal development. We have aplasia, that would mean we have a lack of development. Hypoplasia would mean that we have a lack of development as well, but it's not as severe as aplasia that we saw in the previous term. Next, we have hyperplasia, and this means that we have an abnormal increase in the number of normal cells. And anaplasia, that means that we have a loss of cell differentiation. So our cells, when we're first born, they go through mitosis and they are growing in number, but we want them to differentiate and become different things like bone cells or blood cells or muscle cells. And so that's what we mean by cell differentiation. So anaplasia is loss of that cell differentiation. And we have a reversal to more of a primitive type of form of cell. And then we have our suffix trophy, which means nutrition. So here we have hypertrophy. So you might be thinking hyper means excessive, trophy means nutrition, it's excessive nutrition, but it really means that your cells are kind of getting this rich nutrition, so we get an increase in the size of that organ that's caused by an increase in the size of the cells, not necessarily the number of cells. If we wanted to talk about an increase in the number of cells, then we would say hyperplasia. So you can kind of see that illustrated using these images here. So we see here on the left is our original tissue with our 9 cells. If we have hypertrophy take place, that means we still have 9 cells. It's just they are larger in size, each of these cells. If we have a hyperplasia situation, that means that we are increasing the number of cells. So here we have 25 cells instead of 9. Quickly, I want to talk about the anatomical position. So there's 5 major criteria to the anatomical position, and that is that you have your eyes directed forward, your body is erect or longitudinal, your palms are facing forward, your limbs are by your sides, and your toes are facing forward as well. I think that's 5. Did I count 5? Okay. So when we are in anatomical position, we have 3 major planes that we can talk about. So in image A on the left here, you could see the frontal plane. This plane divides the body into anterior and posterior parts. We have an infinite amount of frontal planes because you can slice the body so many different ways, dividing it anterior, meaning the front, from posterior, meaning the back. And then we have our transverse plane in image B, where it is slicing the body in a horizontal section. So we're dividing the body from the superior or upper portion, from the inferior or lower portion. So again, we can have an infinite amount of transverse planes because we can divide it in so many different areas. And then lastly, we have our mid-sagittal plane. Now this, we only have one plane because it equally divides the body into right and left halves. If we were to draw a line down, let's say the left shoulder, down the body, that would be a sagittal plane, and we have an infinite amount of sagittal planes that divides the body into unequal right and left halves. So next I want to go through some of the combining forms of those terms that I was using, anterior and posterior and so forth. So antero means toward the front, or we can use the word ventral. Ventral means belly, so it's toward the belly. Posterior means toward the back, or we can use the term dorsal, which also means back. Ventro, as you guessed it, means belly or side, means belly, and dorso means backside. Medio means middle, and latero means toward the side. So we would use a term like medial or lateral to mean pertaining to the middle or pertaining to the side of our body. And lastly, we have trans, the prefix trans, and that means across, kind of like you saw in the transverse plane, how it was moving across the body. Next, we have supero, which means the uppermost part of the body, so toward the head, and inferior means the lowermost part of the body, so meaning we're moving away from the head and toward the feet. Now, these next two terms, proximo and disto, get a little confusing. We pick a origin. So let's say if we're talking about the esophagus or the intestines, the origin would be the starting point of where food would go in from. Or if we're talking about a body limb, like let's say your upper extremity, we would be talking about the origin there being the shoulder. So we would use the word proximal there. The shoulder is proximal. Whereas if we use disto for distal, that would mean far or distant. We could say the hand is distal. It's further away from that origin of the shoulder. Or if we're talking about the intestines or the esophagus, we would say, for instance, the distal part of the esophagus, meaning the part of the esophagus that's closer to the stomach, not closer to our throat. Next, we have cephalo, meaning toward the head. We already know encephalo means head, so this one should be an easy one. And lastly, here we have caudo, which means toward the tail. So I put this together just to give you some practice in understanding what these terms mean. So we're just going to do the first couple ones, and then you could do the latter ones yourself. So antero plus medio, N, would mean that we have the term anterior-median, meaning it's toward the front, but also down the midline of our body, down that mid-sagittal plane, if you will. Next, we have posterior-medio, and we would use the term posterior-median. So similar, means toward the back, but in the midline of our body. Now, if we do something like dorso plus latero, we would get dorsolateral. So an example of this would be like your kidneys, because they're more toward the back of your abdomen, so that would be posterior, and they're also toward the lateral, more toward the outside of your body, instead of being down the midline. So we would say they are posterior lateral. Now let's discuss supine and prone positions. In supine position, your belly is up, so this is supine position in B, and your hands are just laying toward your sides. So you can notice that this is not anatomical position, so your palms are not facing up here. They're actually, this is the posterior portion of your forearm and hand, but anterior portion of your arm. If you are in the prone position, that means that your belly is down and your back is up. So again, if you look at the upper limbs here though, you're going to have the anterior part of your forearm and hand facing upward, whereas the posterior part of your arm is facing upward. And then for the term supine and pronation. So supination is when you are going to, let's say you're looking at your nails or the back of your hands, and then you are going to do something called external rotation. So look at the back of your hands right now in front of you, and then I want you to rotate your hands so that your palms are facing up. And that is supination, almost like your palms are facing up to hold bowls of soup. That is supination. And then if you turn them back to look at the back of your hands or your nails, that is pronation. And when you do pronation, you are doing something called internal rotation. And for our body regions, whoops, these should be pretty self-explanatory. I had an image here. I don't know why it's not showing up. But anyway, you have your head, and so that is going to be from the base of your skull up would be your head. Your neck would be where you have your cervical vertebrae, in place. Your torso is going to be the area where your thoracic vertebrae starts, and you have your whole thoracic cage, so including your ribs, your sternum, going down to the abdomen and your back. All of that is your torso. And then your extremities would be your upper limbs and your lower limbs. So I guess we can point this out on this guy over here. So here's the head. Here is our neck. This would be our upper extremity here. And then this would be your torso with our thorax and abdomen in place. And then we have your lower limb or lower extremity, which would be this over here. Now let's talk about some combining forms for body regions and structures. We have abdominal, which means abdomen, pretty self-explanatory. We have acro, which refers to our extremities, both upper and lower. Cysto means cyst or bladder or sac. Dactylo means digits. And then we have laparo, meaning the abdominal wall. So you may have heard of a laparoscopy where we are going to gain a visualization of the inside of the abdomen. Next we have amphialo, which is going to refer to our umbilicus. The umbilicus is your belly button. Ancho is going to refer to our nails. So if somebody has anchomalacia, remember that suffix malacia means softening. So this would be a softening of your nail. And then we have pelvi, meaning the pelvis. So if I was to give you the term abdominopelvic, that's referring to our abdomen and pelvis together. Peritino refers to the peritoneum. We're going to discuss this more within our digestive system, but this is going to be a serous membrane in our abdomen that helps to protect our abdominal organs. Next we have podo, which means feet. So if you go see a podiatrist, this is one who is going to specialize in feet. And then we have soma or somato, which means body. There used to be a lingerie store called Soma, and I thought that was clever because soma means body. Next, we are going to talk about some abdominal quadrants. We here see that your abdomen has been split into 4 different sections, which we call quadrants. There's also a way to divide the abdomen into 9 different areas. We won't be discussing that today, but we'll revisit it another day. So you can see that we have divided this into your right upper quadrant, your left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and your left lower quadrant. And the reason that we use these quadrants is to identify and have an idea of where somebody is maybe having some pain, and then we can zero down on what the organs in that area are and figure out what the diagnosis would be. Next, we have abdominal paracentesis. So this is a surgical puncturing of the abdomen, and this is done to withdraw fluids for diagnosis or to remove excessive fluid that might be found in the abdomen. You guys remember that centesis meant surgical puncturing, right? Here in this image, we are seeing ascites that is an abnormal accumulation of fluid in our peritoneal cavity or in the abdomen area. Usually this is an indication of liver disease, and we may use what we saw in the previous slide, abdominal paracentesis, in order to relieve some of the pressure and get fluid to test for this. So let's talk about body fluids real quick. Body fluids are going to comprise more than half of our body's weight. The main fluids in our body are going to be blood and lymph, and our body fluids are found either within cells, so we would call that intracellular fluid, and that makes up about 40%, or it's found outside our cells, so we're going to call that extracellular fluid, which would make up 20% of our fluid. Our extracellular fluid is further divided into plasma, which makes up 5%, and plasma is the fluid part of our blood, and the other portion is interstitial fluid, which fills the spaces between our cells. And then we have edema. Edema is not on this scale here though, because it is an accumulation of fluid in an interstitial compartment. And sometimes we can get an excessive amount of edema, which is going to cause swelling within our body. Next, we have some word parts here for body fluids. So we have decreo, which is going to mean tearing, tearing, or crying. Lacrimo is also going to mean tearing or tear or crying. And I'll show you guys where your lacrimal bone is. If you take your fingers and pinch the bridge of your nose, where your fingers are pinching is right close to the area where your lacrimal bone is. And the reason that they called it lacrimal bone is because they thought these are where tears develop. But it turns out they actually develop on the lateral portion of the eye, but the name stuck, so they kept it. Next, we have hydro, which means sweat or perspiration. So if someone has hydrosis, it is an abnormal condition of sweating. And hydro means water. So if something is hydrophobic, it means water fearing. Our next word parts are a continuation of body fluids. So we have lympho, that is referring to lymph, such as our lymphatic system. Next we have muco, meaning mucus. Poiesis means production. So if we have hematopoiesis, hemato, remember, means blood. So this is the production of blood cells, is what hematopoiesis means. If I had erythropoiesis, erythro meant red. So that would be the production of red blood cells. Next term or suffix is poietin. Poietin is a substance that causes production. So for example, we have this hormone called erythropoietin. So erythro meant red, right? So erythropoietin is a hormone that causes production of red blood cells. Next we have pio, which means pus. We've had that before. And salo, which means saliva or salivary glands, and we've had that before as well. Now I want you to stop and do exercise 14 on page 115. Then come back to the screencast. All right, continuation of body fluid word parts or combining forms. We have coagulo, which means coagulation. This also means clotting, like your blood clotting. If you cut yourself, your platelets go there and clot your blood so you stop bleeding. Cyto we've already had, means cell. Erythro we've had before, means red. Hemo or hemato means blood. Leuco you've already had, means white. And now we get to thrombo. Thrombo is new for us, and that means clot. So I talked about platelets, how they come to an area where you have a cut, and they are going to coagulate or clot in that area so we don't bleed. These platelets are also called thrombocytes. They are cells that clot. Okay, so I use that suffix cyte, which we know means cell. And osis you guys have already had. This is increased or abnormal cellular components. So like thrombosis would be an abnormal condition of clotting within our circulatory system. And then we have penia, which means deficiency. So if we have erythrocytopenia, erythro means red, cyto means cell, and penia means deficiency. So it means that we have a deficiency of red blood cells or low red blood cell count. Now I want you to do exercise 15 on page 117 and show it to me on Monday. Okay, last thing that we are going to cover are acronyms and abbreviations. So we have LLQ. We saw this before in our quadrants. So this means left lower quadrant. LUQ means left upper quadrant. RBC stands for red blood cells, or it can also refer to red blood cell count. RLQ is for right lower quadrant. RUQ means right upper quadrant. And lastly, WBC stands for white blood cell or white blood cell count. So that is it for chapter 5. Please finish up your exercises and show them to me on Monday.